morning, everyone, and welcome to the PivotBoss pre-market video for Tuesday, September 30th, 2025. I am Frank Ochoa, aka PivotBoss, looking at the daily time frame here of the ES. You'll notice a doji-like day here heading into the RTH Open. Just 40% of average range, 22 points of total range right now, and trading at the center of the previous week's range. That's what we started with yesterday in our pre-market video, was that we basically closed within the extremes here of the previous week's range. And when you do so, you're now in a trading range, especially when the previous week's range is rather wide. And we saw a lot of that price action already play out as the market continues to hang around the previous week's mid and close. You can see, again, after a strong start to the upside early, overnight and pre-market came right back to the middle, sitting here now. And again, we could trade anywhere in here up to the edges and still remain back within the range overall as this range continues to develop here heading into the end of the quarter here on the last trading day of the quarter. Do we get a government shutdown? What does that mean moving forward? If so, that could delay the NFP report on Friday, something to keep an eye on there. But as we head into the new quarter and finishing at the highs of the quarter here, again, oftentimes one thing to look for is how does price respond above the quarterly high. If there's any rejections here, there could be a risk off back to the previous month's midpoint or even the previous quarter's midpoint ahead. So watching to see how this plays out outside of this 2-week trading range. All right, looking at the NQ. Similar price action here with the NQ. This one's also trading within the current previous week's range, closed precisely at the midpoint of that range. Early strength, a little pullback. Doji-like price action here heading into the RTH Open. 38% of ADR, just 102 points of range within that compression here. Again, like the ES, we could stay and continue to chop around in here. We could get to one of the edges of last week and then fade right back in. So this range right now continues to develop. We could trade anywhere within that range. Now, from a day perspective, the idea is for bulls to defend into morning weakness for a shot at a check mark move higher to a higher high above yesterday's high. That's the goal right now given the current short-term up move. A failed new low could offer an opportunity back up as well, as we're seeing in the ES, a higher low in the NQ developing now. The key level to watch here will be the previous session's midpoint. If this thing can drive through 848 here, it starts to open up 25K for the day. All right, looking at crude oil. This one's down 2% here on OPEC news. Big time sell-off the last couple of days. And another rejection after strong movement to the upside. We're coming into a seasonal bearish window as it is, and we may not get much more of a bounce here. Again, the way that this thing has continued to be rejected continues to open the door here to a retest of that 5820 level, which is the FOMC key level from May 7th. That's an unfilled FOMC key level. Do we go get that here in the week ahead? So 6145 been a key level here. We're approaching that level here later today. If we push through and break through that level, do we start to open a path to 5820? Looking at gold futures, this one's down here about 0.4% right now, heading into the RTH Open, getting into 38.9920. 38.9920, especially after the 3-day burst to the upside. We talked about that over the last several days here, that this 3-day range looked very much like this 3-day range, and the idea was for a 1 to 3 day move to a new high. We got 1, 2, 3 days into 3900, basically 3900. Now we're starting to pull back a bit. This up move remains highly directional, very bullish, in a very intense auction right now, with 4,000 still could be ahead. Now, are we headed for a blow off top type of move up ahead? We will see how the early portion of October treats us here. If we get a rotation into the pivot range below, do we get new highs ahead? That would be the expectation as of right now, headed into 4,000. So a break of the previous month's midpoint, and you're seeing a wider correction. That would occur at 3,900. All right, looking at the YM. The YM currently seeing middle of the range price action as well. Again, previous week's high, previous week's low, closing around the midpoint here of that range. And here we are trading near the mid. At some point you would anticipate a move to one of the extremes like we mentioned to begin the week, and then you likely fade back in as this wider range continues to develop here. Again, we're closing the month here and closing the quarter today. And then we see how price responds to prices above the previous quarter's highs. Does it lead to a rotation back into the previous month's midpoint and the previous quarter's mids up ahead? Something to keep an eye on there for the YM. Looking at Bitcoin, this one's down 1% right now. Big time strength the previous session. We did ask the question in the trading room, is this strength legit? Is it going to see further follow through here to the upside? Or is this kind of in line with some of the strength we've seen here recently that have been rejected pretty quickly right back down the next day? We're seeing a little bit of that weakness right now come into play. A little bit of a thrust reversal here off the 116 level. I'd mentioned previously that 108 to 118 remains the range, so we could continue to see movement into 118, back down, and trade movement and expansion. Again, from a longer term entry perspective, would love to see something back down toward the 200-day moving average into 100K, perhaps below it into 95. Until then, we could still see a rally that takes us through 118 into new highs up ahead, given the right breakout and transition style day. So still watching to see how this thing develops here, but clearly a ton of compression here. A ton of compression, a lot of energy. There could be a significant move coming out of this range down the road. Which way does it go first? Does it go down, then up? Are we going up right away? How's this thing playing out? That's going to be something to continue to watch in Bitcoin. Looking at ETH, this one right here, also seeing a recovery of 4,000. That's the big level here that we've talked about. 4,000, how was that going to respond? And once it closed below it, it was able to reject it back up and hold. That's a pretty big level. We still have kind of a downtrend in play, still retesting some big time pivot-based EMAs from below after crossing down through them. How does it respond there? We have an inside value relationship developing heading into the new month of trading. That pivot range is narrow and it's inside this month's pivot range. That can tend to be an explosive relationship, a very high volatility style relationship. And oftentimes when that relationship develops after a mature trend to the upside, it can tend to signal weakness up ahead. So we'll see again, how does this thing resolve itself out of this compression. Long term, still loving the upside potential here, but do we get some sort of short term rotation to the downside first into the 3,000s or perhaps even lower? So watching to see how this behaves here. But from a short term perspective right now, this zone right here, very, very important. How does price respond here today at around that 4250 to 4300 zone? If it can push beyond it, we're opening up some upside. Failure to get beyond it, do we get a lower high and a downside continuation? All right, that is it for now. We'll see how this plays out heading into the rest of the session. Good luck, trade well, and I'll see you in the trading room. Take care.